The city square buzzed with life, a lively mix of sounds and colors filling the air. Street vendors called out to passers-by, offering everything from steaming cups of coffee to handmade trinkets. Families strolled together, children laughing as they chased pigeons that scattered at their approach. Tourists snapped photos of the Grand Palace standing tall in the distance, its golden spires gleaming under the afternoon sun. Amid all this activity, no one paid much attention to an older man making his way through the crowd. Thomas Calloway moved slowly but deliberately, his steps steady despite the years etched into his face. His clothes were simple, but he carried himself with pride. A faded military uniform jacket hung over his arm, its fabric worn thin but carefully maintained. Medals pinned to his chest clinked softly with each step, drawing occasional glances from those nearby. Some recognized the significance of the decorations. Others simply saw an elderly man lost in thought. Today, Thomas had come here for a reason. He wasn't sure why exactly. He only knew that something inside him urged him to visit the palace gates. Perhaps it was nostalgia, or perhaps it was the need to reconnect with a part of his past he had tried so hard to leave behind. Whatever the reason, he felt drawn to the royal guards stationed there. Their polished armor reflected the sunlight, and their disciplined posture commanded respect even from strangers. As Thomas approached, his heart began to race. Memories flooded back, memories of battles fought long ago, comrades fallen, and promises made beneath starless skies. He remembered nights spent huddled around campfires, sharing stories and dreams of returning home. Those dreams felt distant now, like fragments of someone else's life. Yet, standing here today, surrounded by the hum of the city, they seemed closer than ever. Reaching the edge of the crowd, Thomas paused. One guard stood slightly apart from the others, his stance unwavering. Something about him caught Thomas's eye, not just his height or build, but the way he held himself. It reminded Thomas of days gone by, when soldiers relied on instinct and camaraderie to survive. Without fully realizing what he was doing, Thomas straightened his shoulders and raised his right hand in a crisp salute. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The bustling square faded into the background as all eyes turned toward the veteran and the guard. People whispered among themselves, curious about the unexpected gesture. Even the other guards shifted uneasily, unsure how to react. But the saluted guard did not move immediately. Instead, he hesitated, a fraction of a second too long for someone trained to respond instantly. Then, slowly, deliberately, the guard returned the salute. His movements were precise, yet there was something unspoken in them, a weight that lingered after the motion ended. Beneath the gleaming visor, his expression remained hidden, but his body language betrayed a flicker of emotion. Was it recognition, surprise, or something deeper, buried beneath layers of duty and discipline? Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just protocol. There was meaning behind this exchange, though neither man spoke a word. As the guard lowered his hand, he tilted his head slightly, studying Thomas with an intensity that made the veteran's pulse quicken. Finally, the guard broke the silence. "You were there," he said, his voice low but clear enough to carry over the murmurs of the crowd. His words sent ripples through Thomas's mind. Who was this guard? And why did his voice sound so familiar? Before Thomas could respond, the guard turned sharply on his heel and marched back toward the palace, leaving behind more questions than answers. The next morning, Thomas woke before sunrise, his mind already racing with plans. He dressed quickly, choosing the simple shirt and trousers that wouldn't draw attention. His medals stayed tucked away in their box. Today wasn't about honor or ceremony. It was about answers. As he stepped out into the crisp dawn air, the city felt quieter than usual, as if holding its breath alongside him. By the time he reached the palace gates, the sun had begun to climb higher, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets. Tourists milled about, snapping photos of the towering structure while guards stood stoically at their posts. Thomas lingered near the perimeter, pretending to admire the architecture while keeping a close eye on the guards' movements. It didn't take long for him to spot the one he'd been looking for, the same figure from yesterday, unmistakable even among the uniformed ranks. This time, Thomas didn't approach. Instead, he hung back, observing carefully. The guard's posture was rigid, but there was something different about him today. A tension in his shoulders, a slight stiffness in his gait. Every so often, he would glance toward the crowd, his visor hiding whatever emotions played across his face. Each time their eyes met briefly, Thomas felt a jolt of recognition. There was no denying it now. This man was Edward. As the hours passed, Thomas noticed patterns in the guards' rotations. They switched positions at regular intervals, moving in precise formations designed to maintain order and vigilance. But Edward always seemed to linger just a little longer at certain spots, near a side entrance, by a secluded courtyard, along a shadowy corridor leading deeper into the palace grounds. It was almost as though he were marking a path, leaving subtle clues for anyone who cared to follow. When the shift changed, Thomas made his move. Keeping a safe distance, he trailed behind Edward, weaving through narrow alleys and hidden passageways until they reached an abandoned wing of the palace. The area was eerily quiet, untouched by the bustle of tourists and officials. Faded tapestries hung crookedly on cracked walls, and dust covered the marble floors like a thick blanket of snow. Here, far from prying eyes, Edward finally stopped. For a moment, neither man moved. Then, slowly, Edward turned to face Thomas. His hand rose to his helmet, hesitating for a fraction of a second before pulling it off. Beneath it was a face weathered by years of hardship, lines etched deeply around his mouth and eyes, scars visible even in the dim light. Yet despite the toll time it had taken, there was no mistaking those sharp features, that familiar gaze. "You shouldn't have come," Edward said, his voice hoarse but steady. There was no anger in his tone, only resignation, and perhaps a hint of relief. Thomas swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I had to," he replied simply. "You know I couldn't let it go." Edward sighed, running a hand over his face. For the first time, Thomas noticed how tired he looked, not just physically, but emotionally drained, as if carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. "It's complicated," Edward admitted after a pause. "Things aren't what they seem. And some secrets, they're better left buried." But Thomas shook his head firmly. "No," he said, "not this time. Whatever happened, you don't have to carry it alone anymore. Let me help you." For a moment, Edward didn't respond. He stared at Thomas, searching his eyes for something. Trust, understanding, maybe forgiveness. Finally, he nodded once, reluctantly, and gestured toward a nearby door. "Come inside," he said quietly. "If you really want to know, I'll tell you everything." As they stepped into the dusty chamber beyond, the air grew colder, heavier. Thomas braced himself for what was coming next. He didn't know exactly what secrets lay ahead, but one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same again. The chamber they entered was dimly lit, its only source of light filtering through a cracked window high above. Dust motes floated lazily in the air, catching the faint glow as Thomas followed Edward further inside. The room smelled of age and neglect, old wood, damp stone, and memories long forgotten by everyone except those who lived them. Against one wall stood a collection of relics: faded flags draped over rusted spears, helmets stacked haphazardly, and boxes overflowing with letters tied together with brittle ribbons. It was like stepping into a time capsule, frozen somewhere between glory and decay. Edward moved to the center of the room and turned to face Thomas, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he simply stood there, as if gathering the strength to speak. When he finally began, his voice was low but steady, each word carrying the weight of years buried beneath silence. "They didn't leave us behind because they couldn't find us," Edward said, his gaze fixed on the floor. "They left us because it was easier that way." His hands clenched into fists at his sides, knuckles whitening under the strain. "After the ambush, I was captured. They broke me, piece by piece, not just physically, but mentally. Days blurred into weeks, then months. By the time I escaped, I wasn't the same person anymore. Thomas listened intently, his chest tightening with every syllable. He wanted to interrupt, to tell Edward that none of this was his fault, but something held him back. This wasn't just a story. It was a confession, raw and unfiltered, and Edward needed to say it in his own time. When I came back, Edward continued, his voice trembling now. I couldn't face anyone. Not my family, not the unit, not even myself. So I disappeared. I took on a new identity, became someone else entirely. The palace guard offered anonymity, a chance to serve without questions or judgment. And for a while, it worked. I thought I could outrun the past. He paused, exhaling sharply as if trying to push away the ghosts clinging to him. But it never really leaves you, does it? Every night, I see their faces, the ones we lost. I hear their voices, screaming for help, begging me to save them. And I can't, no matter how hard I try. I can't make it stop. Thomas stepped closer, his heart aching for the man standing before him. You're not alone in this, he said softly. We all carry scars. Some are just harder to see than others. Edward shook his head bitterly. It's not just about the scars, Thomas. It's about what I did, or didn't do afterward. I let them erase me. I let them turn me into a ghost. And now, his voice broke, and he turned away, shoulders slumped under the burden of his words. Now I don't know who I am anymore. Thomas reached out, placing a hand on Edward's shoulder. You're still the same person you were back then, he said firmly. Maybe stronger, maybe wiser, but you're still here. That counts for something. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Finally, Edward straightened, wiping a hand across his face. There's more, he admitted quietly. Things I haven't told anyone. Promises made under duress, secrets kept to protect people who wouldn't understand. If you're going to stay, you need to know everything. Are you ready for that? Thomas didn't hesitate. Yes, he said without missing a beat. Whatever it is, we'll face it together. And so, Edward began again, his voice steadier this time. Piece by piece, he unraveled the tangled web of his past. The betrayals, the sacrifices, the choices that had shaped him into the man standing here today. With each revelation, the truth grew clearer and heavier. But for the first time in years, Edward no longer bore the weight alone. The faint glow of a desk lamp illuminated Thomas's small apartment, casting long shadows across the walls. Outside, the city hummed with its usual rhythm, cars honking, distant laughter floating through open windows. But inside, the air was heavy with silence. Thomas sat at his cluttered table, surrounded by mementos of a life he tried to leave behind. Old photographs, yellowed letters, and tarnished medals lay spread out before him like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be solved. He picked up one photograph, holding it closer to the light. In it, a group of young soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces smeared with dirt, but lit up with smiles. They looked tired but alive, their camaraderie evident even in the grainy image. At the edge of the frame stood Edward, his expression quieter than the others, but no less determined. Thomas traced the outline of the boy's face with his thumb, as if doing so might bring him closer to understanding what had happened all those years ago. Memories flooded back in waves, each one clearer than the last. He remembered the first time he met Edward, a shy teenager fresh out of training, eager to prove himself despite his nervousness. "Don't worry," Thomas had told him then, clapping him on the back. "We've got your back." And they did, for a while, at least, until the day everything fell apart. Thomas set the photo down and reached for another. This one showed a different scene. A makeshift camp under the stars, tents scattered haphazardly across uneven ground. The men were gathered around a fire, passing around a battered tin cup filled with lukewarm coffee. Edward sat slightly apart from the group, his knees drawn to his chest, staring into the flames. Even then, there had been something about him that set him apart. Not aloofness, exactly, but a quiet intensity that made people uneasy. It wasn't until later that Thomas realized it was fear. Fear of failing, of letting others down, of not being strong enough. His gaze drifted to a folded letter tucked beneath a stack of papers. Carefully, he unfolded it, smoothing out the creases. The handwriting was shaky but familiar. Edward's farewell note, written just days before the ambush. "If I don't make it back," the letter began, "tell my family I did my best." Thomas had carried it with him ever since, unable to bring himself to send it. For years, he assumed it would never reach its intended recipients. Now, sitting here in the dim light, he wondered if Edward had survived after all. And if so, how much of himself he'd left behind. A knock at the door startled him, pulling him out of his thoughts. He hesitated, unsure whether to answer. Who could be visiting him at this hour? Slowly, he rose from his chair and opened the door a crack. Standing on the other side was Mrs. Harper, an elderly neighbor who often checked in on him. She held a plate of cookies wrapped in foil, her kind eyes crinkling at the corners. "I thought you might need these," she said gently, offering the plate. "You seemed distracted earlier." Thomas managed a weak smile, accepting the gift. "Thank you," he murmured. "I've just got a lot on my mind." Mrs. Harper nodded knowingly. "Sometimes the past finds us when we least expect it. Just remember, you're stronger than you think." Her words stayed with him long after she left, echoing softly in the quiet room. Stronger than he thought. Was he? Or was he simply chasing ghosts that refused to stay buried? Either way, he knew one thing for certain. Tomorrow, he would return to the palace. Not because he expected answers, but because he owed it to Edward, and to himself, to try. As he returned to the table, his eyes fell once more on the photograph of the young soldier. The weight of unanswered questions pressed down on him, but beneath it lay a spark of determination. Whatever secrets the palace held, whatever truths Edward had kept hidden, Thomas vowed to uncover them. Because some stories deserve to be told, even if they end in lament. As Edward continued to speak, the room seemed to grow darker, as if the walls themselves were absorbing the weight of his words. Thomas listened intently, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. Each revelation hit him like a hammer blow, not just because of the sheer magnitude of what Edward had endured, but because of the names that surfaced, names he recognized all too well. "You remember Captain Harris?" Edward asked, his voice barely above a whisper. When Thomas nodded, Edward's gaze hardened. He knew. He knew we were walking into a trap that day. The intel was wrong. It wasn't just bad luck. Someone sold us out. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. Captain Harris had been one of their most trusted leaders, a man that followed without question. To hear that he might have betrayed them felt like a betrayal of everything Thomas believed in. "Are you sure?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer. "Unsure," Edward replied bitterly. "When I was captured, they told me things. Things I didn't want to believe. At first, I thought it was just another tactic to break me. But later, after I escaped, I started piecing it together. Orders that didn't make sense, movements that left us exposed. It wasn't random. Someone wanted us gone." The anger simmering inside Thomas began to boil over. His hands balled into fists at his sides, nails digging into his palms. "Why didn't you say anything sooner?" he demanded, his voice rising despite himself. "We could have done something." "And then what?" Edward shot back, his own frustration spilling out. "Who would have believed me? The broken soldier with no proof, no witnesses. They already thought I was damaged goods. If I'd spoken up, I'd have been labeled a traitor, or worse. So I stayed quiet. I buried it, just like everyone else wanted me to." The accusation stung, not because it was aimed at Thomas directly, but because he knew it was true. How many times had he pushed aside doubts, telling himself it was better to move forward than to dwell on the past? How many nights had he lain awake, wondering about the decisions made above him, only to silence those thoughts by morning? But now, standing here in this forgotten chamber, there was no escaping the truth. And as much as it hurt, Thomas realized something else. This wasn't just Edward's burden to bear. It belonged to all of them, to the survivors who had walked away when others hadn't, to the families who still waited for answers, to the world that had moved on far too quickly. "We can't let this stay buried," Thomas said finally, his voice firm despite the storm raging within him. "It's not right. These people deserve to know what really happened." Edward stared at him, his expression torn between fear and hope. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "This isn't just about us anymore. There are powerful people involved, people who won't hesitate to destroy anyone who gets in their way. Are you ready for that?" Thomas didn't flinch. "I'm not asking if you're ready," he said. "I'm telling you we don't have a choice. If we don't do this, who will?" For a long moment, Edward said nothing. He turned away, pacing the length of the room as if trying to outrun the decision looming over him. Finally, he stopped and exhaled sharply, running a hand through his graying hair. "All right," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "If we're doing this, we do it right. No shortcuts, no half-truths. We gather everything we can. Letters, reports, anything that proves what happened. And we prepare for the fallout." Thomas nodded, feeling the surge of determination replace the anger in his chest. This wouldn't be easy. They both knew that. But for the first time in years, they weren't facing it alone. Together, they began sorting through the relics scattered around the room, searching for pieces of evidence that could rewrite history. As they worked, the air seemed lighter, charged with purpose instead of despair. The road ahead would be long and fraught with danger, but one thing was certain: silence wasn't an option anymore. Not for them, and not for the ones who couldn't speak for themselves. Months later, the city square was alive with a different kind of energy. Gone were the bustling tourists and casual chatter. In their place stood rows of solemn faces. Veterans, families, strangers, all gathered to honor those who had been forgotten for too long. At the center of it all stood a new memorial, its bronze figures gleaming softly under the morning sun. One figure saluted while another bowed his head, their expressions frozen in quiet respect. Beneath them, an inscription read, "To those who served, suffered, and survived, together." Thomas stood at the edge of the crowd, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. Beside him, Edward shifted uncomfortably, still unused to being recognized after years of hiding in plain sight. Neither man spoke as they watched people approach the monument, laying flowers or simply pausing to reflect. Some cried openly, clutching photographs of loved ones lost to war. Others stared silently, grappling with emotions too complex to put into words. For everyone present, this moment meant something deeply personal. Rachel Meyer arrived shortly after, her presence drawing murmurs from the crowd. She had become a household name following her explosive expose, praised by some and vilified by others. But today, she wasn't here as a journalist. She was here as a witness, someone who had helped bring these stories to light. As she joined Thomas and Edward, she offered them a small nod of acknowledgement before stepping back, letting the ceremony unfold without interruption. The speeches began soon after, delivered by survivors, historians, and even politicians brave enough to admit past failures. Each speaker added another layer to the narrative, one of pain, resilience, and ultimately, hope. When Thomas's turn came, he stepped forward hesitantly, aware that hundreds of eyes were now fixed on him. He cleared his throat, gripping the edges of the podium to steady himself. "I didn't think I'd ever stand here," he admitted, his voice carrying across the square. "For years, I told myself it was better to move on, to leave the past where it belonged. But the truth is, you can't outrun it. Not when it's part of you." His gaze drifted toward Edward, who met it briefly before looking away. Today isn't just about remembering those we lost. It's about honoring the living, the ones who carry scars no one else can see. And it's about making sure this never happens again. His words resonated deeply, earning murmurs of agreement from the crowd. When he finished, applause broke out. Not loud or jubilant, but heartfelt and steady. As Thomas returned to his spot, Edward leaned closer, speaking so only he could hear. "You did good," he said quietly. They needed to hear that. By the time the ceremony ended, the sun had climbed higher in the sky, casting golden light over the square. People lingered, reluctant to leave, as if afraid the moment might slip away once they turned their backs. Eventually, though, the crowd began to thin, leaving behind scattered petals and lingering echoes of shared grief. As Thomas and Edward walked away together, shoulders brushing slightly, neither felt the need to fill the silence between them. They had spent months reliving their darkest memories, confronting truths most would rather forget. Now, finally, they allowed themselves a measure of peace, not because the pain had vanished, but because they had found a way to carry it differently. "You know," Edward said after a while, breaking the quiet, "I used to think I didn't deserve to be remembered, that I failed everyone." He glanced at Thomas, his expression softer than usual. "But maybe remembering isn't about perfection. Maybe it's just about showing up, even when it hurts." Thomas nodded slowly, understanding exactly what Edward meant. "We showed up," he replied. "That's enough." And as they disappeared into the flow of the city, the weight of their journey still heavy but somehow lighter, they knew they had done more than uncover the truth. They had given it meaning. The lament would always remain, woven into the fabric of their lives. But so too with the legacy of those they had fought to remember. A reminder that even in loss, there is strength, and even in sorrow, there is hope. Days turned into weeks as Thomas and Edward worked tirelessly, piecing together fragments of a story that had been deliberately buried. The dusty chamber became their sanctuary, a place where the past came alive through faded documents, brittle letters, and whispered memories. They pored over every detail, cross-referencing names, dates, and locations until the puzzle began to take shape. It was exhausting work, but neither man complained. For the first time in years, they felt like they were fighting for something bigger than themselves. Edward unearthed old mission reports hidden in the corners of forgotten crates. Some were official, stamped with seals of approval. Others were handwritten notes scribbled hastily during moments of chaos. Each document added another layer to the truth, revealing patterns that couldn't be ignored. Orders issued too late, reinforcements diverted without explanation, warnings ignored or outright dismissed. "It's all here," Edward muttered one evening, his voice thick with emotion. "Every lie, every betrayal, right under our noses." Thomas nodded grimly, holding up a letter he found tucked inside an old journal. "This one's from Corporal Daniels," he said, his hands trembling slightly as he read aloud. "He wrote it days before the ambush. Says he reported suspicious activity to command. But no one listened." The words hung heavy in the air, a haunting reminder of lives lost because of negligence, or worse. But gathering evidence wasn't enough. They needed someone who could help them amplify their findings, someone willing to risk everything to bring the truth to light. That's when Thomas remembered Rachel Meyer, a journalist known for her unyielding pursuit of justice. Years ago, she covered stories about corruption within the military, earning both praise and enemies in equal measure. If anyone could handle this, it was her. Reaching out to Rachel wasn't easy. At first, she was skeptical, brushing off Thomas's call as the ramblings of a bitter veteran clinging to conspiracy theories. But when he showed up at her office with a folder bulging with documents, her demeanor changed. She flipped through the pages, her brow furrowing deeper with each revelation. By the time she reached the final report, her hands were shaking. This is huge," she whispered, looking up at Thomas with wide eyes. "If even half of this is true, it'll change everything." With Rachel on board, the pieces fell into place faster than either Thomas or Edward had anticipated. Articles began appearing online, exposing decades-old secrets that sent shockwaves through the nation. Politicians scrambled to defend themselves, while historians scrambled to verify the claims. Families of fallen soldiers demanded answers, their voices growing louder with each passing day. What started as a quiet quest for truth became a national reckoning, forcing society to confront the sins it had tried so hard to forget. For Thomas and Edward, the attention was overwhelming. Reporters camped outside their homes, cameras flashing whenever they stepped outside. Supporters hailed them as heroes, while critics accused them of stirring up trouble for personal gain. Through it all, they remained steadfast, speaking only when necessary and always together. They knew the risks. They'd seen firsthand how power protected itself, but they also knew they couldn't stop now. One evening, as they sat in the dimly lit chamber surrounded by the remnants of their investigation, Edward broke the silence. "Do you think it'll make a difference?" he asked, his tone tinged with doubt. "Will any of this bring them back?" Thomas hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "No," he admitted finally. "It won't bring them back. But maybe it'll give their families closure. Maybe it'll stop it from happening again. And maybe, just maybe, it'll remind people that we owe it to the fallen to remember their sacrifice, not erase it." Edward didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared at the pile of documents spread across the table, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. "All right," he said softly. "Let's finish this." And so, they kept going, driven not by anger or revenge, but by hope, a fragile, flickering flame that refused to be extinguished. Even amidst the storm of controversy and grief, they held on to the belief that the truth mattered. Because sometimes, lament isn't just about mourning what's lost, it's about honoring it. The crowd around Thomas began to stir, murmuring with a mix of curiosity and confusion. Some people glanced at him, their eyes lingering on his medals and the quiet determination etched into his weathered face. Others turned their attention to the retreating figure of the royal guard, whose polished armor caught the sunlight as he marched away. The moment had been brief, but it left an undeniable impression, like the first crack in a dam holding back something vast and powerful. Thomas stood frozen, his hand still hovering midair from the salute. The guard's words echoed in his mind. "You were there." It wasn't just a statement. It was an accusation, a question, and perhaps even a plea, all wrapped into 3 simple words. But what did they mean? And why had the guard spoken at all? Protocol dictated silence, especially in public. Guards weren't supposed to engage with civilians, let alone acknowledge them personally. Yet this one had broken rank, if only for a fleeting moment. As the murmurs grew louder, Thomas lowered his arm, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on him. He forced himself to take a deep breath, trying to steady the storm brewing inside him. His heart pounded against his chest, each beat reverberating through his body like the distant echo of artillery fire. Memories he thought he'd buried long ago clawed their way to the surface. Memories of muddy trenches, piercing whistles, signaling attack, and the faces of men who would never return home. But amidst those fragmented images, one face stood out clearer than the rest. A young soldier, barely more than a boy, with sharp features and a quiet strength that belied his age. Edward, that was his name. Thomas remembered now. They'd served together during the war, part of the same unit tasked with some of the most dangerous missions. Edward had been their scout, always volunteering to go ahead, to map out enemy positions so the others could follow safely. Everyone admired his courage, though few understood the toll it took on him. Then came the day everything changed. The ambush, the chaos, the desperate retreat. When the dust settled, Edward was gone. Presumed dead or captured, no one ever found him. Over time, Thomas stopped asking questions. Life moved forward, as it always does, and eventually, he convinced himself that dwelling on the past wouldn't bring anyone back. But now, standing here in the middle of the bustling square, he couldn't shake the feeling that the guard's voice belonged to someone he once knew. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Could it really be Edward? Was it possible that the boy who disappeared all those years ago had survived and was now hiding behind the visor of a royal guard? The idea seemed impossible, yet the pieces fit too perfectly to dismiss. The slight tremor in the guard's hand when he returned the salute, the recognition in his tone, the deliberate choice of words. It all pointed to someone carrying secrets far heavier than any armor. Thomas's thoughts raced as he watched the guard disappear into the palace gates. He wanted to call out, to chase after him and demand answers. But something held him back. Not fear, exactly, but uncertainty. What if he was wrong? What if confronting the guard only made things worse? Still, he couldn't ignore the pull of curiosity tugging at him, urging him to dig deeper. Around him, the crowd began to disperse, losing interest in the odd exchange. Vendors resumed their calls. Tourists continued snapping pictures, and children laughed as they darted between adults. To everyone else, life went on as usual. But for Thomas, nothing felt normal anymore. The world had shifted slightly on its axis, tilting just enough to reveal cracks he hadn't noticed before. As he walked away from the square, his mind swirled with possibilities. If it truly was Edward, then what had happened to him after the war? How had he ended up here, serving as a royal guard? And most importantly, why had he chosen to remain silent for so long? Each question led to another, forming a labyrinth of doubt and intrigue that Thomas couldn't escape. By the time he reached his small apartment hours later, exhaustion weighed heavily on him. Yet sleep eluded him. Instead, he sat by the window, staring out at the city skyline, replaying the scene over and over in his mind. The guard's voice lingered in his ears, haunting him like a ghost from the past. Whatever truth lay hidden behind those golden gates, Thomas knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't rest until he uncovered it.